bucket at the ready. It's Bjorken on cleanup duty.
G8.
Oh my God! He stole the Elder Dragon! He's gonna shoot! You're kidding me! Centauri fights early! Kill number one! Here comes kill number two! And he's in for number three! Number four! The king of Pentago! Oh my God! You gotta be kidding me! You can change the players, but the faith remains! And the faithful shall be rewarded!
What's up, NA hopefuls? Welcome back to another edition of the LCS Hopium podcast. I am, as always, your host, Hanji, ready to dive into the end of the first round robin. And as always, I'm joined by the best Sam to ever Sam. Sam.
That is a tall statement right there.
There's a lot of Sams, but you're the best.
As a self-proclaimed analyst on here, I'm not really an analyst. Don't worry about it. Sam, I am. Definitely got teased for that one a lot as a child, or that just got brought up. But probably not important right now. Yes, I am Sam, resident, not feeling as good 100 Thieves fan, as I'm sure you could probably see why, but we'll get into that. Trust me, we will get into that.
Yeah, not a great week for the boys, but we did just finish up our first Super Week, and with that, our first round robin has come to a conclusion. So I think it's fitting to kind of just start there. What are your overall thoughts on this first half? Like as a whole, kind of taking into account the games that were played, the, competitiveness, just things of that nature.
It's an interesting one to see where teams have gone so far. We had a lot of teams that were honestly just a lot of teams that I think people had slightly higher expectations of, either stumbling early on and sort of struggling to find a foothold. Some of them still are, and believe me, we'll talk about that. Whereas others starting out a little stronger, such as the 100 Thieves, showing some of that promise I think at least some people would expect to see from the pedigree of members of that team, and then hitting those stumbling blocks, just sort of having other teams either exposing weaknesses in their current team, their playstyles, their strategies, or just sort of dropping the ball in their team play, their coordination. There's a lot of different things to point to depending on different teams. And I think it's interesting too that this first round robin, with the way patch structures and things ended up shaking out with the security breach, the hack that took place in Riot in late January, I believe, sometime in January, really extending that first patch. This first round robin up until this Super Week almost kind of felt like a mini world scenario where we were sitting and stewing in sort of the same patch and the same meta for several weeks longer than we are really used to in competitive play. So I think it's going to be interesting seeing, even after this Super Week, where we've started to see people adjust to the new patch, 13.3, I believe? Something like that.
I think we finally are off of the B.
Yeah, I think there's some hot fix or other. I'm sure there's a million things they've done, but seeing how teams adjust to both this patch and I think especially the next patch on the horizon is going to be a very impactful one, really going to shake up mostly how bot lane centric I feel like so much of this meta has become.
Yeah, everyone's kind of said it at this point, where top side, even like mid to some extent, really just feels like they're there to make sure that the bot lane can get ahead. And if your bot lane gets ahead, you have a higher probability of winning the game. And as much as I'd love to say, yes, finally ADs are in the spotlight, it's just not healthy for the game. I think what's best, like the league's at its best when, every role has impact, even though it's hard to get to that parity. We've gotten a little close here and there, but right now it is just super bot centric. I think that's kind of been my big takeaway for the first round robin, is it really did just feel very stagnant, I guess is the best way to put it, just because we were stuck in the same patch for so long.
Right.
And now that we're finally able to move into, you're seeing teams kind of move away from those double marksmen in the bot side, getting a little more like engaged supports in there. Like, I'm a huge Rakan fan, so seeing him a little bit more in pro play has been a lot of fun. We'll talk about Rakan and a specific player from a team that may or may not have upset the first place team in a bit. But it's just, it's interesting to see teams already starting to move away from that. I'm a huge fan of engaged supports, so I think it'll be a little more interesting as we move our way towards, the second round here. But I think another thing that's been interesting about this, half two, is you heard it a lot in the beginning of the season, that this was going to be the most competitive season of the LCS that we've ever had. Just, teams coming in, the rosters that were developed, a lot of the, interesting prospects that were coming in. Everyone thought that this was going to be one of those seasons that, we would be talking about for years. Do you think that it's lived up to that hype, or is the discrepancy between the top and the bottom just still way too high?
Well, it's tough to say because I think you absolutely can't deny there is some truth to those statements in the way we've seen things shake out. Sure, we still have sort of the top three kind of upper echelon of teams right now that have separated themselves from the pack. However, I feel like so much, especially in recent years of LCS, it's kind of it's kind of just felt like a top three, top four, and no one else really came close. Like maybe 5 and 6 could upset occasionally. Maybe they could even come close to making a run in a playoff bracket, a la CLG from last year. But those bottom four teams, especially in previous years, I feel like have just felt completely down and out, completely outclassed. The schedules for teams felt very predetermined in a way, because if you looked at a schedule and saw something like an EG, 100 Thieves, a Liquid, a Cloud9, some of those previous really high echelon teams facing a
GG.
team that frankly just didn't seem to have it together, sure, maybe some teams would get a lead, maybe there'd be some like little bits of hope here and there, but at the same time, they just they just seemed outclassed, whether it was macro play, whether it was team fighting. It just felt like there wasn't really a way for those bottom teams to really stay present in that environment. Whereas I think, to a lot of teams' credit, already we're seeing, big shakeups in the sort of 4 to 8 placement range. A lot of teams, I mean, TSM Golden Guardians, both on a pretty good hot streak, starting to climb the ranks, knocking down the likes of 100 Thieves. CLG showing some promise as well, and even Liquid in 8th place. I think that 3 and 6 record, just looking at Liquid's record at face value, I think doesn't really do a service to them, because the amount of, I would say, almost heartbreaking games we've seen out of Liquid this season where they are so close. They have either found a really strong early game lead or they have clawed their way back with a scaling comp. They're getting so close time and time again, but it is just those little mistakes of Harry, playing too far forward, Pioshik seeming a little desynced from the rest of his team on calls, just the little missteps, players being too far forward, lacking in coordination, that have eventually just chipped away at their win-loss record. But I do think there is a lot more that team can show if they can pull those mistakes together and play more disciplined. And I think a lot of that goes across most of those sort of middle of the pack teams right now, where a lot of them, they have those sort of chinks in the armor. They have things that they need to work on, whether that's individual play, whether that's discipline, whether that's team coordination. But I think all of them do have the potential to make more happen in the second round robin. And then that brings us, and unfortunately, I don't know if I could say the same for Immortals and Dignitas. I think those two have kind of fallen victim to the sort of previous bottom LCS status, which is quite unfortunate to see. But for the most part, I think, to summarize all of it, we're seeing what I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of 6, 7, maybe even 8 potentially viable teams who I would personally say could do something in a playoff situation within a bracket. Whereas in previous years, it sort of just felt like, yeah, it's going to be one of the top 3 or the top 4, and everyone else will kind of just be cannon fodder.
Yeah, no, I have to agree. I think when you look at the middle of the pack, like, yes, some teams have definitely, peeled off and gotten a little further ahead, or in some cases, ahead in the wrong way. I think one of the most interesting things that you told me this week is like, someone has to be last. It's just the nature of, having teams in a competitive environment. Just seeing a team this deep in last place is a little disheartening, right? Where you're trying to have the highest competition possible, and a team is just at 0-9. It feels a little surreal. But excluding that, like, very very drastic, like, FlyQuest at, what are they at now? 8-1.
8-1, yes.
Yeah, 8-1, and you're 0-9. I think everything else is, there's a lot of room for shakeup. You're seeing a lot of very close games. You're seeing a lot of games kind of just come down to those last minute mistakes. Team Liquid definitely is the bearer of a lot of those heartbreaks. Even 100 Thieves, we'll touch up on that later, but I think they've been pretty close too in some games to making something happen, only to just kind of have it all fall apart there in the last couple of minutes of a game. It does feel like we have a lot more room for teams to possibly, challenge at the top. I don't want to go out and flat out say that, a Team Liquid can go into a series against FlyQuest and come out victorious, but hey, they might give them trouble. Like you were saying, we don't know what that, polished version of the team looks like. We've seen a lot of good from them, but at the same time, we just haven't seen enough. But I would agree, this is a very competitive season. I think there's enough going on in the middle of the pack to potentially give us something fun come playoff time. And you brought it up a lot, upsets, potential, teams that could potentially make a splash. I really want to shout out TSM, because I genuinely think that TSM team is doing a lot of good. Compared to what the expectations were coming into the season, that team's the only team that beat FlyQuest. That game, I've watched it a handful of times now, is quite literally one of the masterclasses of just like, yeah, we're going to pick hard engage, we're going to CC you, and we're going to try to outscale you with an unconventional top laner, because no one else is playing Cho'Gath at the moment. And I think they piloted those champions very well. They found picks. They really picked on Spica. There's a lot to be said about Maples Talia, which I don't think is going to be coming through anymore for him, because he is an absolute monster on that.
It should not be. Absolutely.
Yeah. All's to say, do you think that this TSM team is a legitimate threat to one of the teams at the top? Or are they just one of those teams that, can on occasion make, get a win here and there?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think already they're sitting at 5-4 in the standings. I certainly can't discount that and say, oh, this is a flash in the pan moment for them. Like, clearly they have that potential. And I think it's going to depend sort of on how these metas continue to develop, how patches continue to shake out. But mostly it's a mix of things. They're already, I think, the thing that has surprised me from TSM is that sort of on a macro level, in terms of team coordination, I don't want to go crazy and say they're insanely clean and they're playing the map perfectly. I mean, that scaling Cho'Gath you were referring to was taking turrets while 0-4, soon to be 0-5, I believe. He was essentially playing the line of, I am earning gold for my team while being worth little to no gold for you, which is a strange thing to see happen in the LCS and to see work out to the degree that it did. Like, it's not it. I suppose what I'm trying to say is their macro. It isn't clean. It's very scrappy, but they're together.
By no stretch
on
of the
it.
imagination.
Yeah, they're together
Absolutely, yeah.
on it. They're coordinated, especially in those games where they win, where they do look good. It's because they're having sort of that level of cohesion that I think we're not seeing a ton out of some of the other bottom of the barrel teams. That is, I think, where a lot of them are coming apart. Now, with Maples Talia out of the question, I do think that, which I absolutely think should be a thing, as much as I do love how the Talia pick has started to shake up this meta a little bit. It's that will certainly be a blow to their macro play, but I think if they can keep up that level of cohesion, maybe have a few more of those sort of outlandish picks in the pocket like the Cho'Gath, have things ready to surprise people, I do think there's potential there.
Yeah, I mean, another person that I actually really want to shout out to, just because, again, I'm a huge fan of Rakan. I think Chimes Rakan looked so good in that game. I think he was finding flank angles. Obviously, Rakan's super powerful at getting those, like, engages from essentially a screen away, and really made Prince's life a nightmare, and that's something that other supports haven't really been able to do just yet. To be fair, I think Winsome was running it a little bit, but I mean, you have a little wiggle room when you were sitting at 7-0 at the moment. But yeah, I mean, All to say is I think this TSM team can get a win, maybe even two in a best of five. I just don't think that they would have everything. And again, this can all change at the as the rest of the split goes on. But as it stands, like you're saying, there just isn't enough for me to comfortably say, oh yeah, Maple's decision making on other champions and Boogie's control of the map is enough to make me go, yeah, this team can beat a FlyQuest or Evil Geniuses in a 5-game series. But hey, who knows, right? Who knows how the rest of the split plays out? Maybe they get all of those little mistakes and those little kinks out, and they look like a really solid team. But I have to give them some props. That's a team that I had pretty low on my power rankings, and honestly, after this week, I'm a little higher on them. But we'll see how it all shakes out. A lot of games left to be played. On that note, we have to, because we have made no attempt to hide our allegiance and our fandom. It was a rough week for you, buddy.
2 weeks, yeah.
Fair enough. I think it's best that we kind of go in and kind of discuss our teams. Like, what have we been seeing from our teams? Obviously, this is where we're most invested. Not to say we're not paying attention to the rest of the league, but this is where a lot of our time and energy goes to. So what have you seen from 100 Thieves? Any positives, any negative? Obviously, there's a handful of negatives, but what have you seen from them? What needs to be cleaned up? What looks okay?
Right. It's a mixed bag, certainly, because you've seen, I don't want to say that all of their losses, not really any of their losses, have been absolute blowouts or something where they just fell behind minute one and never quite recovered. The closest was probably the Golden Guardians game, if I remember correctly, to that. But even then, there's little glimmers of hope. They're bringing out different picks. Obviously, early on, they were pretty much the early adopters of the Lulu Zeri within the NALCS, and obviously showed the sheer amount of power someone like Doublelift can have on that pick. I think since then, teams have gotten a little bit more comfortable with not only playing that combo themselves, but also playing around it, drafting around it. But they've shown, I think, on an individual level, each of the players on this 100 Thieves roster have shown potential. They've shown some good plays. I mean, Tenacity had that game where he almost single-handedly brought it back on Fiora. Now, admittedly, was that the Cloud9 game? I don't remember. No, we started with that.
No, it was not. Yeah, that was your first game.
Was that EG then? I feel like that was against one of the top teams, but regardless, like, sure, you could say the enemy team is greeting for a pentakill and basically hands him a Quadra underneath his Nexus turret, and that is a little bit greedy, but, he had the lead early on. He was doing very well within his lane individually, and I think Tenacity, he has had those moments. He's shown that he can, sort of in isolation, go toe-to-toe with players like Impact, like Summit, like Fudge. I know that Fudge game looked bad, but even that first kill in the game on his Jax versus Fudge's Cassante, that really came down to just mere little moments and mistakes that got Fudge that first blood that snowballed the matchup. I think individually Tenacity has shown a lot of promise. Bjergsen, you could maybe argue, isn't as consistent a player as perhaps he's been known for, but still, it still seems like they can rely on him to scale up on something like the Azir. The Zilean is obviously still a threat. He's willing to play counter matchups such as the Taliyah, the Tristana, which the Tristana, I feel it was very close to working until the exact moment he went too far, and then it wasn't. But I do have sort of an overall analysis on that as well. Obviously, Doublelift and Busio have had some amazing Zeri Lulu games. I think Busio's been a little inconsistent, but even off of that combo on things like the Lucian Nami, the amount of flash bubbles that kid was going for on Nami and hitting them too, like that can't be understated. There is a lot of potential there. Closer is still, I think, a very consistent jungler, very consistent presence across that team. There's a lot of individual potential, and you see that in the form of either them getting leads early on and then just little mistakes here and there, either on a macro level, misunderstanding their team comp, perhaps, what the goal, when and where they should be fighting with the power spikes they have, or even just simple things like positioning, people getting caught a little too far forward, a little too out of place, farming the wrong wave. It's little mistakes very often that I think are getting them, which in theory are things they can fix for the most part. And then on top of that, there is of course the bigger problem of coordination. Are they looking on the same page? Which I think we've seen enough glimpses of when these five players lock together that I do think it's possible. I think they do have that potential in them, but it's hard to say. And I think definitely a lot of it is so much of their compositions, they're either playing for scaling, with the Azir, with the Zeri, something like that, or they're playing with a Bjergsen Zilean. Suddenly all the eggs are in the double lift or the tenacity basket. Like, they're really focusing their power points into these specific players in many games. And I think the problem they're running into with that is that this meta is, I would say almost more so than many others, tailor-made to punish individual mistakes. And I think a lot of that comes down to the effective champion pool. You are seeing things like Maokai, Vi, Sejuani locked in pretty much every game. Things like Ashe support, Jhin getting played in ADC. We are seeing so much individual lockdown and pick potential and often point and click CC coming out from positions like jungle, like support, occasionally like ADC, even top lane, to the point where I think what so many teams, not just 100 Thieves, are running into is that these little mistakes feel so much more game-changing in a meta where there is almost always a Vi lurking over a wall ready to cease and desist you, hit you with the Vault Breaker, lock you down for half a second, a Maokai to throw down that twisted advance, that ultimate, with a Jhin ultimate often over top of him. There's so many pick tools that are common in this current champion pool in this meta that these mistakes on an individual level in coordination and macro play and being in the wrong places feel so much more deadly for teams.
Yeah, I mean everything that I've seen from 100 Thieves, I think a nice part of it is champ pool. So it was the FlyQuest game where Tenacity tried his damnedest on the Fiora.
That was the FlyQuest game. Goodness, that's right.
Yeah, and that one was very interesting to me because they, I think, first rotationed the Zaya Rakan
Right.
on the 100 Thieves side, which a lot of the analysts were kind of in agreement that that's a little too early to show your cards there. And they got pretty punished by having to play into a Nautilus and a Kai'Sa, which we know very well is a very, very hard lane to go into when you have such little range on the Rakan and the Zaya.
Right. And even picking Zyrakan, it's an interesting combo in the context of the current meta, because most of what you're running into is either these sort of long-range bully you out of lane combos, with the Caitlyn Lux, occasionally with Jhin splashed in there, different things like that, or you're just sort of running into these dedicated combos like Kai'Sa and Nautilus, or even a little bit. Oh, I have completely lost my train of thought. Excuse me. I think the Zyrakan, it has its place in this current meta and the way things are shaking out. I think if you want it for something like, say, trying to hold down a Zeri Lulu early on, there is potential there, although that is a very risky thing to do, perhaps, with the amount of safety Lulu gives, plus just the amount of safety Zeri has built into her kit as long as walls exist. There's potential, but I think you definitely have to be conscious of it, especially in this bot lane meta where it is so much about putting on pressure early because the dragons were buffed in preseason, because dragon buffs are so impactful. Getting pressure on bot lane, having that easy ability to rotate for dragons, push your enemy under turret, farm, support item gold off of just hitting the turret or hitting you. So much of this meta is about pressure, so you need to be very conscious about where you are showing these picks and how they will stack up into what your opponent has to throw against it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, there's just been a little bit of desyncs. It just hasn't looked as clean as it did early. Maybe a bit of that is, the over reliance on specific picks, and just not having a lot practiced. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but definitely was a very odd week for 100 Thieves. Nothing that they can't bounce back from. They're still in the hunt for a higher seeded spot. Just having to clean up a couple of, I can't say small things, but cleaning up a lot of their play and really trying to find just a little more cohesion. But I don't know. I'm not too worried. They have very very proven and experienced players, so I think they'll be okay. Just a little more time, and hopefully things will gel just fine. Which then brings us to me, the resident Cloud9 boy. Great Super Week from us. Uh, I can't say I am overly confident and optimistic in Cloud9 right now. Obviously, it's great that we're winning. I say we because I am part of the team. It's great that they're getting wins. Just I don't know if I like the way that we're getting wins. It feels like almost every game now, at least for the past three, it feels like we've found ourselves in a deficit and have had to find the miracle team fight to make it happen. Thankfully, people are making mistakes and this team is good enough to punish you for them. But to be put in that position every time where it's like, yeah, we're going to need you to mess up pretty please so we can, make this 5K deficit, a 2K gold lead because you gave up Baron, just doesn't sit right with me. And I feel like a lot of it has been from a lack of proactivity, which is very, very odd. Because when I think of Blabber, I think of, an aggressive early game jungler who wants to make things happen, who wants to get out on the map and, show presence and be dominant. But it just feels like, if anything, he's been getting dominated. Giving up the Elise early was very, very odd to me. But, it was a pick that we got bullied on, and somehow, again, through a very, very poor team fight from Team Liquid, we were able to come back in that game. And man, was that a lot spicier than I thought it would be. Because apparently that entire game, team chat was just filled with flame. But I love my banter. I think I messaged you and told you, like, the one thing that traditional sports, makes me a little like upset about is that whenever something like that is going on the court, or you can just tell that something is upsetting a player, they're never going to come out and say it because the PR will never let them. And for better or for worse, a lot of the esports players will be very quick to let you know, like, oh yeah, he said this and this. Apparently the Team Liquid people were saying that the Cloud9 Academy roster was way better when they had a 5K gold lead, and that was very quick to dissipate. But yeah, I don't know if I can confidently say, like, yeah, Cloud9 can compete with the top, the top of the top right now. I definitely think we can beat some of the lower seeded teams, but I can't give my full 110% confident take that Cloud9 can make a deep run in the split.
Right. And I think what we're seeing out of current Cloud9, as you sort of rightfully pointed out, is very similar to something like an old school TSM syndrome, or something where there are weaknesses, particularly in the early game. They are giving up objectives, they're giving up kills, they're giving up leads, but they kind of just team fight better than most teams in the league outside of maybe an EG or a FlyQuest. Because I do think EG has a similar problem to a lesser degree, or sort of a similar situation where they are kind of riding on their coordination and their team fight prowess perhaps a little bit more than they need to. But at the same time, that is something we have historically seen go very far in the environment that is the NALCS. Will that work out in this new, more competitive LCS? I don't know. That remains to be seen. But it is, I think, for so many teams, having that sort of spark of just being that coordinated team, just knowing, just being able to go into these fights and just make it work, that's something that I think in many ways is hard to teach and hard to sort of develop over time. Not impossible, certainly, but I think that can be a very solid foundation for a team to have if they can then build out upon that and recognize where the woes that are forcing them to rely on those team fights are coming from.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I did kind of give the fun comparison, and it's it's TSM, but to a bigger degree, I will say it was kind of like G2. That's how G2 used to be over in Europe. Is they would actually go into deficits pretty often, and then they'd just like force one team fight where you're like, oh well, they're down 3 to 4K, like this is a dumb team fight, and then all of a sudden you see them like ace the enemy team at like 20 minutes, and you're like, okay, I guess the game's actually over. And it is something to be said, since this is a roster that, for the most part, remained intact, given the only change that was made was the mid laner. There's a lot of, already pre-existing coordination, which is very important. We're seeing that. And at the same time, I guess that is where the one big, I don't want to call it just discrepancy or, mistake is, but the mid lane has been pretty weak. Not to say that Diplex isn't, playing his role well, but there is some occasions where you want a little more out of him. But I think given time and space, I think he can morph into the mid laner that Cloud9 needs. And that's what's nice about having someone young, is that you can really shape them into a player that fits, the play style you're trying to play.
Right. And I think the main thing we do need to kind of caution with something like this, where you have this team that kind of just can ride so many different game states out on just the we fight better win condition, that can work all well and good within, your regional league, where the other teams, how they tend to fight, sort of the kind of strategies that are getting thrown at you. It can be such a dangerous thing on an international level for those
Absolutely.
teams if they don't really have another style to fall back on, or simply just haven't found ways to shore up weaknesses that are leading them to deficits, leading them to the moments where they have to rely on these climactic team fights, these sort of big comebacks to win. If you're suddenly going up against a super high caliber international team that is a lot less prone to mistakes and perhaps even has similar team fighting ability to you, then suddenly your weak early game just becomes so much more of a dangerous thing against those teams that know how to punish you for it, know how to hang on to those leads. So it is something they are going to have to address in the long run, I believe.
Absolutely. We are kind of approaching the end here, so I think there is no better time for it than to go right into the Hopium hot take of the week, my friend. So, as always, these are always way too early, but kind of seeing the landscape right now, our top 3 teams are FlyQuest, Evil Geniuses, and C9. If you were to have to give the pick right now, in a 5-game series, which of those 3 teams is more likely to get upset? And who do you think would be the team to upset them?
I mean, it's the obvious answer. I as much as I hate to say it, it's not FlyQuest for sure. Just because
It is not.
we have seen,
It is not.
we've seen such a level of consistency on them. That is why they are still a game above the rest of the pack. They are standing heads and tails above the league. Is just they've shown so much more of that consistency across their games, just in being able to play different styles, staying together, staying coordinated. Maybe a little bit of weakness shown in that TSM game, with Spica being perhaps a little too far ahead of the rest of the team on certain plays, certain moments. But overall, I think just the level of mistakes they are making is so much lower than the rest of the teams. They are kind of playing so much more disciplined, knowing their points of strength, knowing when to attack. So I just don't see that. Unless some big changes happen, I don't know if I see them getting punished over the course of a 5-game series enough to drop those games. Between EG and Cloud9, that's an interesting one, because I think I said earlier that they kind of have very similar problems for the most part, in that a lot of their games, whether it is coming off of an early lead, coming off of an early deficit, or even just losing out to some macro play, giving up too many objectives, perhaps losing a pick here and there, they are kind of having to rely on that coordination and that team fighting to see them through. But I do think, as you correctly highlighted, Cloud9 is currently the one making a lot more of those mistakes overall, looking a little bit more shaky than Evil Geniuses, I would say, at least in the current sample size of games we have so far. So unfortunately, I do have to say your boys in blue would be my pick to be most likely to get upset or have a bit of a downturn in a longer series format.
Well, get the presses ready. Get working on the headline, because I agree, actually. As much as that pains me, I have to kind of look at what I've seen so far, and there's been too many games now where I've seen just a complete lack of wanting to do anything in the early game. Seeing, the other team go in and make those proactive plays and try to set up those dives and get waves, prepared to be, put in a position where our bot lane, which is one of our strong points, has to struggle. And there just isn't that killer instinct that I would expect in a meta where, junglers are this aggressive, where you're seeing a lot more of those level 3, ganks. It just doesn't seem like there's much going on right now. Maybe that's because, traditionally Blabber is someone who likes to go towards the mid lane early. Maybe he just doesn't have that, that same link that he has with other mid laners with Diplex just yet. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree. There's just too many flaws right now. There's too many like small mistakes that keep popping up that make me go, yeah, if, to answer the second part of the question, if we did go up against a TSM team who's, ready to make those proactive plays, or even Team Liquid, because if we're being honest, I think Team Liquid had Cloud9 beat if it wasn't for that one dragon fight where good old Jan decides to like flash Gale Force into the pit
to kill
secure absolutely.
To kill, yeah. I believe it was a Cassante? It was a tank, right? Or was it a Sion?
Yeah. Either way, he made an oopsies.
Yeah.
Certainly. And if it wasn't for that oopsies, I genuinely think, given how little Cloud9 had done, that game should have been over. So yeah, if I had to take a stab at who was most likely to beat a Cloud9 in a 5-game series, I would probably give the edge to, just off recency bias, to TSM. But yeah, I mean, I'm in full agreement with you, man, as much as it sucks to say. And okay, I cannot discount Bjergsen and Doublelift in playoffs might be completely different animals. Let's not throw that out just yet. If that is one of the matchups that a team has to go into, like, you should feel a little worried.
Oh yeah, I think those two players, I mean, they have such a history in those playoff situations, in those longer series. They have such a breadth of history with their champion pools and different picks that are just so kind of specific to them at this point. There's a lot to look out for in that potential scenario, but we've got a lot more best of ones to play through to get there first.
Woo! That is true. Hey, the second round robin starts. Oh gosh, are we going right in, or do we get a reprieve?
No, we should be starting back up this Thursday.
Woo! No Super Week. Lovely.
With 100 Thieves FlyQuest. Just gonna rip that
God,
Band-Aid off.
Rip the Band-Aid.
Immediately for me. For FlyQuest, I mean, certainly.
Yeah, they're done for.
Yeah, of course, naturally.
Thanks so much for joining me again, man. I think that was a very fun episode and a great way to kind of recap the entire first round. I can't wait to see how the rest of it all shakes out. It's very interesting. A lot more movement can be done in the middle of the pack there, so I'm very excited. I think there is hope for the rest of the season, and we'll see how the rest of it goes. Everyone, take care. Have a good rest of your week, and hopefully this will be up same anytime, same any place.
There's a time.
Oh God.